welcome once again to Android Design in Action. I'm your host, Roman Nurik.
And hi, my name's Nick Butcher.
And today we're going to be talking about designing collections. Collections specifically, I guess we'll talk about what we mean by collections in a second, but collections are all about lists, and presenting lists of objects and collections of things, groups of objects. Anyway, let's just jump in. So, like I said, collections are really just groups of objects. I guess things like a list of items in a shopping cart, or a list of books, things like that. So today we're going to be talking about a couple of things. I guess we're going to be talking about consumption of collections as well as mutation of collections. By consumption of collections, really mean things like being able to view a collection, obviously, being able to search through it, filter through it, things like that, as well as things like responsive design for collections, and Nick will do a bit about that. And then also we're going to talk about mutations of collections, specifically ways in which you can allow users to add items, remove items from a collection, reorder them, as well as take action on certain items in a collection. All right, so I know that was a super fast intro. Before we jump into all these specific details, we just want to look at one thing first, is the basic presentation. So throughout the rest of these slides, throughout the rest of today's episode, we're going to be looking at very specific details, but from a very high level. This is stuff that we've obviously already talked about in the past, but we're going to be looking at collections from a number of different viewpoints. Obviously, you can use a list to present a collection of objects, a grid to present a list of objects, or a collection of objects, as well as something like a view pager, like swipe between different items within a collection. We're going to be focusing on the first two here. We're not going to spend too much time on the view pager, or the swiping between items. So yeah, just kind of keep that in mind, I guess. Before we jump in, Nick, do you want to add anything to that super fast intro?
No, as you said, we're not going to talk about what a list is, what a grid is. We're going to more kind of go through the options you have on Android for working with these collections, doing things to them.
Cool. All right, so let's jump in to collection consumption. Nick, do you want to talk about collection consumption?
Yeah, absolutely. So here we've kind of called this section distillation. So this is when you're acting upon items within the collection, kind of refinement and so forth. So we've pulled up 3 examples here on this slide. The first of which is a quick way to kind of section and navigate around content within the collection. So some standard ways of doing that on Android we've pulled out, working from left to right. First off, we have this combination of headers with an index fast scroll thumb. So in this example here, we're using the People app for your list of your kind of people and contacts and so forth. So you can see that each of the kind of letters of the alphabet has a section, and in this instance, it's using a pattern we call sticky headers. So you can see here that E has stuck to the top and will stay in place until it's scrolled out of view by the next section header F there. And combine that with a quick scroll thumb is a fast way to navigate these kind of long lists of quite structured data. So that can work quite well if your data is a good match for that. Doesn't work so well if your data doesn't have such a kind of rigid and expected structure. So it depends on your data needs whether that will work. The next kind of distillation method, which is common on Android, we're using this kind of view change. It's using one of the facilities of the action bar, which allows you to kind of flip the representation of the data. So in this example, we're using the gallery application, which lets you view your collection of photos as either a grid of photos, or you can get this cool kind of zoomed out film strip view where you can see them one main photo mainly at a time, with a couple more peeking in on each side and quickly fling between them. So yeah, here we're using the action bar's spinner or drop down control in order to provide this kind of switch of views or flip of view type. And the last kind of distillation action I'm going to talk about is sorting. So in this example here on the right from a former episode of ADIA, we're using a action bar button in order to reveal a submenu to do some sort. So if you see the kind of the 3 lines action button, this is the standard iconography on Android for sorting. Pressing that reveals a submenu which lets you pick how you want the data sorted. So pretty simple stuff. These are the common ways on Android which you can do these kind of distillation type behaviors.
Yeah, and one more thing I wanted to mention is that another way to do the view change is to have an action bar button that lets you toggle the view. But I actually find that what Gallery does here is actually kind of neat. It kind of expresses both the title of the current screen as well as the type of view, all in the top left kind of view details area, which is kind of a neat way to expose that. And then anytime you press the spinner and make a change, only the subtitle, I guess, changes. The top title camera doesn't change, which is pretty cool.
Definitely.
All right, moving on.
Okay, so some more types of distillation we have here is, and these are kind of slightly different to the previous types in that these distillation actions will actually act upon the item, so it will refine or show less items rather than just flipping to another representation, really. So it's more kind of like filtering behavior. So the first common one is to use the kind of standard search tree behavior in order to just filter through the items already shown on screen. So in our example, we're going back to the people application again, where you can start searching for a contact. So this works really well for large data sets where if you had to pick from a list of kind of filter options, it might be too large or too kind of non-specific. So search can work quite well there. The next up is a simple kind of filter switch where you're changing what kind of on discrete filterable things. So in our example here, we're using Pocket, which lets you store different kinds of media for later consumption. And they use this kind of corpus switch filter to kind of filter down just to kind of articles, videos, images on the kind of media type. So that's a pretty common one. And again, that's implemented as an action from the action bar. So pressing that action reveals a submenu. And then in this particular visual design, Pocket have chosen to use the kind of the right pointing down and right kind of arrow to kind of display that there are further options here, which is kind of optional. We see it similar to sorting behavior in that you don't necessarily need to have that drop-down option.
And another area where this is used, this kind of bottom right triangle, is with the share action provider. So if you have a custom, or I guess if you use the share action provider or the share pack, as it's sometimes known as, and you press the button, it actually shows kind of an anchored list as well. So it's a very similar presentation. So it's quite often coupled together.
Yeah, and it's got quite good support in the platform for building these, so it's easy for developers to implement this kind of stuff using submenus. Mm-hmm. And the last one, which is one of my favorite ones, is using this right side drawer in order to provide some filtering behavior. So again, this screenshot's from an earlier episode of Android Design in Action where we went into quite some depth about this topic. But I'm a big fan of this because it has a lot of the benefits of the drawer. A left-hand drawer will have for navigation as it can for actions on the right-hand side. So some of those benefits are that it kind of appears at the kind of Chrome level, so it's above the content in a way, which is great for filtering in my opinion, because you can see it acting at a level above the content rather than in line with the content. And what's more, if your data supports it, you can imagine changing these filtering settings and seeing the kind of content behind it update live, like the number of results displayed, reducing, and so forth. Which that kind of instant response is kind of a great thing to provide. So in this instance, we, as with the navigation drawer, you have an affordance in the action bar. So here we have a filter icon, but this would also be accessible by a kind of an edge swipe, a bezel swipe from the side, giving real quick and instant access to the filtering options. So
one quick note, well actually two quick notes. The first is if you want more details on this specific design, look at the past episode titled GDG Oslo. I think we also covered brand consistency in that episode, but this is from that episode. And the second thing was a live example of the actual interaction can be found in the Google Plus app, the way in which they do notifications. They use this type of interaction for notifications, but it's perfectly suitable for other types of things. For example, filtering. Generally not great for navigation, for core navigation. That's really more for the navigation drawer on the left side of the screen, I guess. But for filtering, for distillation of content in a collection is a great option. All right.
Absolutely.
Let's move on to responsive layout.
Yeah, so when we're talking about collections, we have to kind of have this extra dimension in our head of the fact that they're going to be displayed on all sizes and shaped devices. So something like a list view, for example, might work great on a smaller device, but it's not going to kind of scale up terribly well to a larger device. Especially when you think about, say, 10-inch tablets in like landscape orientation, lists can be a pretty bad way of displaying information because you end up with these excessively wide list items with like lots of white space and so forth. Mm-hmm. So the first pretty simple thing you can do is switching up from, say, using a list in a smaller device up to something like a grid view in a larger device. So programmatically, this is very simple to do on Android. Both of these list and grid components kind of have a common base, so it's very easy to do. You just provide a different layout. Say, when I over this size width, use this representation of my item, rather than this list type one, use this grid type one. And this can work especially well if you have very kind of visual, like large images or thumbnails, which you can use to form these kind of like grid items. So this is one simple way in which you can use the space better to present your collection. If you want to go into details about this pattern as well, at last Google I/O, Roman and I gave a talk where we documented some code on how you might go about implementing this. Mm-hmm. Cool. The next thing you might consider doing is breaking out into this kind of like staggered representation. So this is kind of like the step up from going from list to grids. This allows you to create a more kind of dynamic, kind of more appealing representation of your collection. It allows you to kind of recognize that not every item in your group might be similar weight. So in this example here, we're showing some kind of news story. If a story is particularly relevant, particularly pertinent to the user, you might take this opportunity to break out of the standard rhythm and take up, say, a couple of cells or so forth. And it's another way of just really kind of utilizing the space that's available to you as you go onto larger devices. Moving on. You can use a combination of these strategies all together as you kind of get more available space to you to play with. And one great example of this is the third-party app Pocket, which I think we've mentioned on the show before, which does a really great job of adapting to the amount of space available to it. So starting on the left on a small device, they use a standard list-driven navigation to kind of show a collection of items. But as they get more room, they kind of break it out into showing a grid view, and then on even larger devices, they switch up to a staggered grid view. So as you can see here, this avoids those problems of having, these awkwardly wide cells. You can imagine if that list view was just stretched all the way across that tablet, it would look pretty uninspiring. And instead, they see it as an opportunity to make the content kind of stand out and use it to highlight stories which might be particularly interesting to the user. So it's kind of great use of the opportunity.
Yep. Yeah, this is just a great example of really kind of having the content, kind of having, I guess, constraints on your content, making sure that images are a certain aspect ratio, making sure that the content never, or the body text never exceeds a certain number of characters per line, and kind of starting with those constraints and designing outward from there.
Yeah, so as you were touching on here, we've just got a slide just to show that when you're thinking about displaying your collections on this kind of variety of devices, you kind of have to let go of a little bit of the kind of strict control of the layout. And one technique that works really well, go on to the next slide, is to use this kind of center cropping technique. So this is a technique which will help you with your images to make them scale from wider to smaller devices, and sacrificing some kind of complete control over the pixel dimensions, but just saying maintain this correct aspect ratio and then pick the right kind of segment of the image in order to display it in the amount of space available to the kind of cell item here. So using the center cropping technique can really help you to build these, the cell contents of the individual items in the group.
Yeah, this works really well for like landscape photography or images like these strips of bacon here. It doesn't work so well when you have people's faces or other things that that have important, or other photos that have important content around the fringes. I think we may have touched on this in past episodes, but this is definitely a very, very important technique to use.
Of course, there's still ways to do that with that kind of imagery, right? You might just have to do a pass at it first and store some data about where the center is, rather than being the physical center of the image. It might be you detect where faces are on your server or something like that, and when you deliver the image down, you pass some information so that it lets you do this center crop technique, but without using the actual center, using a focal point instead.
Yeah, absolutely. Or using face detection, right? Yeah, it's definitely a good technique. A little hard, a little more difficult to implement for developers since there's no kind of like random or arbitrary center crop. It's just like kind of the center of the photo, or it kind of centers around the photo. But definitely something that can be done. It's not incredibly difficult, but can be done.
Cool. And so one of the techniques that kind of Google's been moving towards is what we like to call this kind of inside-out design. So it's a kind of more of a change in mindset than anything else. It's thinking about your content first, thinking about what the information you're trying to display, what your building blocks are, and building outwards from there, rather than starting with a grid, starting with a Photoshop or a canvas of a certain size, and then trying to slot the information into it. It's kind of going the other way around. So in a lot of our Google design language, we're moving towards these cards or these these blocks of content, these kind of individual blocks of content, and then building from there outwards. So we think about the content, and we think it could have different representations. So it might have, a big card here is one certain size. It might have different sizes it can be in, like maybe small or tiny cards. It might have different landscapes it can be in. But all of these are just thinking about, this is my piece of content, and here are some ways in which it can, express itself. It can draw itself. It can represent itself. And then once you have those building blocks, you can then build outwards and then see how they slot together. So starting from the individual one, you can place it into a canvas on the screen. And then by using just simple proximity rather than kind of any bounding boxes or kind of supporting Chrome, you can just build them up into these clusters of items. So you can build up your grouping, your clustering of items just by placing them next to each other. And then you can introduce this variety of the different representations. So you might use different orientations, different size cards to denote something might be more important. So this item on the left might be most relevant to me, and it can take a different rhythm than the rest of the items, and use that to kind of express why the information is important to me. And the concept here really is to build this up into these canvases, which is like a collection of items, where the canvas is more of a conceptual thing rather than being kind of bounded to how much screen real estate on a certain device, but it's more like ideally this is the group of items which want to be displayed next to each other. So then when it comes to actually time to kind of show this on a device, the device might show a portion of this cluster at once. So it might be this is the kind of portion of items, and I would be able to then perhaps horizontally swipe to move along and see more of the cluster available to me. Or on a larger device, I might be able to take all of this conceptual cluster of items and see them all at once on screen. So as we say here, it's kind of like starting with the smallest building blocks, starting with your information first and building outwards rather than starting with your grid and trying to fit information in. So one example of looking at from the Play Store of how to represent a movie might be, hey, here's a few ways in which we know we can represent the information that's important to this movie, like the poster, a title, a price, a description, a reason why it's interesting to you. And you build these different building blocks, these different sizes at which it can express itself. And then the device at runtime kind of just picks the right representation to show this cluster of information. And it might be able to show only one thing on screen at a time. It might be able to put it next to some other stuff and build up this cluster of information. But you start from these building blocks, these conceptual building blocks. And that was just kind of like a rapid run through this approach. If you want to learn more, then we did a whole show looking at this kind of stuff when we talked to some of the designers who worked on the Google Play applications. So do go back and check out that show if you want to hear some more about how we at Google have been using this kind of inside-out design principle to design our kind of collections.
Excellent. All right, so with that, let's move on to mutating collections. One of the things, or there's a couple of different ways to mutate collections. What we mean by mutating is allowing the user to make changes to the collections. And we're going to try to speed through this since we have very little time left. But the first is the very basics of adding or removing content to or from a collection. So how can you do this? The first, pretty obvious way is this example in the People app. You simply have an action bar item that allows you to add something. In this case, you're allowing the user to add a group of contacts or add a new group that's going to have no contacts for now. And we'll talk about that in a second, some details there. Another more kind of potentially interesting way of doing this, more useful way of doing this, more contextual way of doing this is to actually place the affordance to add new content in line. So here in Google Play Music, you'll notice the Create New Station button is in line with the actual stations. And an even better example is here in Google Keep, which we'll actually use quite a bit throughout the next few screenshots. You'll notice here that in the to-do list or in this kind of a checklist, the next item, the item that you're going to be adding next, is kind of this faded out, almost semi-transparent item, indicating that it's not there. It's almost like a ghost of an item. It's not there, but click here or touch here and start typing your content, and it will become a real item. So it's almost kind of hinting that to create a new item, here's where you start entering your information. So this is a very kind of good technique for allowing users to add content in line with the rest of the items in the collection. Another very good technique for this is to use the empty state. So the empty state is something we talked about in last week's episode on onboarding. But basically, the empty state is when you have no content in a collection. And we find that this is one of the biggest missed opportunities across apps on Google Play, is that when there's no content, the app either says there's no content or sorry, there's no content, or just a loading spinner or something. That's a great opportunity to actually let the user fix that problem, right? Actually let them populate that collection, let them fix the problem of the empty state. So in here in Google Keep, if you have no reminders, the center of the screen actually has this nice big affordance, this nice big touch target to create a new reminder. Touching that actually takes you into the create a reminder flow. So those are some basic ways to add items to a collection.
And I think quite often people, when think about adding items, they think that's an action. Adding is an action, and therefore, hey, I know where actions go in the action bar. Right. And I think that can often be kind of a missed opportunity. I think these inline options can often convey a lot more context with them. I mean, this Google Keep one in particular, you instantly know exactly what it's going to add there, what's going to happen there. It kind of conveys a lot more information than just having a simple button in the action bar. It can do a lot more.
Exactly. And the key there is context, right, and direct manipulation. It really kind of helps satisfy that design principle. All right. So sorry, folks. I think we're having some technical difficulties, but now let's jump back into it. So one thing I wanted to mention when talking about adding items, and specifically exposing an action in the action bar for that, is you should try to, when possible, show the actual icon representing the object type, as well as a plus overlay or plus suffix as it's labeled here. And this is really kind of a platform convention. It helps establish context for what exactly you're adding. In cases where you don't really have a great iconic representation of the content, you could just show a plus, but for sure it's preferred to show the plus as a suffix, again, to establish context. All right, so let's move on to removing items. So there are a number of different ways to allow users to remove or delete items from a collection. The first is using this kind of contextual action overflow that you would anchor, that you would place inside of your object. And what happens is, when the user presses these three little vertical dots, and actually the touch region should probably be expanded to be about 48 dip. The bottom right 48 dip of the screen. If they touch that overflow, they'll get an anchored pop-up menu of things that they can, of actions they could take on that object. So in this case, I'm looking at a station on Google Play Music, and if I press these three vertical dots, I get this delete action. So that's one way to delete something. Another way is to trigger the contextual action bar. So here, this is gallery. If you long press one of these photos, and then you can also press other items that are adjacent to select those as well, you'll actually see the contextual action bar appear at the top of the screen, and then you can choose to delete those objects. So these two things, the contextual action bar and these this contextual action overflow, I guess. These are also useful for other things, but deletion or removing an item from a collection is one very common way to do that. Now, another way to remove items is to use something called swipe to dismiss or swipe to remove. And this works best in kind of like a vertical list or horizontal list of objects, where if the user starts swiping left or right in a vertical list, or up or down in a horizontal list, the object kind of is removed from the collection. The nice thing here is that as part of this I guess interaction, as part of this gesture, you can also kind of have the adjacent items slide in or animate in to fill up the gap that was left by the item that was removed, to help kind of convey the concept that this thing has been kind of removed from this set of objects.
I'm a big fan of this swipe to remove pattern, because it's a very kind of visceral, direct manipulation pattern. So rather than operating machinery, like pressing a button to remove something, I'm actually like grabbing the item and getting rid of it. It's kind of really satisfying.
Yep, exactly.
It's also quite prevalent throughout the Android system as well, right? So like notifications, the recent stack use it. A bunch of places it's used throughout Android, so it's a pretty well understood gesture as well.
All right, so let's move on. There's a bit more to say on the contextual action bar, but we'll talk about it in a bit. So beyond just simply allowing users to add or remove items to or from a collection, one of the things you may want to do is allow them to reorder things, reorder objects. An example of this could be personalizing kind of the order of navigation sections that you care about, or something as simple as reordering a set of tasks in a task list. So let's talk about some of the ways in which you can allow users to do that. The first is to use something called like a drag grip. So you'll notice that in these first two examples, on the left you have Google Play or Google Keep. On the right you have Google Play Music. There's these three horizontal little lines, and it's kind of a smaller version of the burger menu icon or the navigation jar icon. So we kind of like to call it a slider, if you get the joke. So this drag grip is basically these three horizontal lines that are vertically centered within the object that you're showing, and it's on the left-hand side. So if the user presses or touches in that area, the object kind of is picked up momentarily, and the user can kind of drag up and down to reorder it. So on the left, you would reorder a set of tasks. On the right here, you would potentially reorder items within a play queue, for example. Nick brought up this earlier, kind of important point around how this works with the navigation jar. One of the features of the navigation jar is that if you touch anywhere, if you're on a screen with a navigation jar, if you touch on the left side of the screen, within the left 16 dip or so of the screen, the navigation jar kind of peeks in to indicate that it's there. And you'll notice actually that that with these drag grips, they're also on the left side of the screen. So those are kind of two overlapping touch regions. So generally, if you have a navigation jar and also want to expose reordering with this kind of drag grip approach, you'll probably either want to rethink what's most important. Is offering the jar there most important, or the drag grip, or just place the drag grip on the right side or somewhere else within the item. So that's a very important point. Another thing to note is that this touch region is actually very small. And since this is a fairly important kind of gesture, fairly important action, you may want to actually virtually extend the touch region to be about 48 dips. So while it looks like it's about 16 or 20 dips wide, you may want to use something called a touch delegate to allow the user to touch anywhere within the left 48 dips of the screen to allow reordering or dragging. So that's the drag grip, and we'll talk about presentation of drag grip in a second. But another way to do this, and actually this is another example from Google Keep, another way to allow users to reorder is to allow them to touch and hold to kind of pick up the object, very similar to how you would trigger the contextual action bar. But then once you touch and hold and start moving your finger around, the object starts dragging around. So you see the ghost image of the object underneath the finger, and then you see kind of a destination rectangle kind of move around to indicate where the object will land when you let go. So this is, again, slightly more direct manipulation like. It kind of fits that principle quite a bit more, but it's slightly less discoverable since it doesn't have an on-screen affordance.
Another thing, just so before we move on, it's important to indicate when you enter this mode as well. So in each of these examples, once you start the drag action, so when you touch on the kind of slider menu or when you long press on the item in Keep, they visually react to this. So in Keep, you see it kind of goes semi-transparent and actually kind of moves, I think about 16 dips up and right or up and left. It's like you've picked it up. It's physically like you've picked it up almost, just to indicate that this is what you're acting upon. So it's good to react, straight to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. One thing we wanted to point out here is that there's actually two visual presentations for the drag grip. The first is this kind of this slider that we call it, the little 3 horizontal lines. A more slightly more common yet older style is this kind of tire track, where basically you have these little kind of boxes, 2 columns of boxes or squares, aligned to the left of the screen, and the interaction is just the exact same thing. You basically kind of touch to pick up and start dragging up and down, but the visual presentation is slightly different. So this is a slightly older style. This is a slightly newer style. Both are certainly valid approaches. All right, so let's move on to acting on items. So this is kind of the big one here. This is actually kind of a summary of a couple of these things. So acting on items, what we mean here is, generally an object in a collection has a single main touch target, itself. When you touch on it, you show the details for that object, or kind of take the primary action. Now, what if you have secondary actions, other things you can do to that object? So the first, and we touched on a couple of these already, but the first is to offer an action overflow, or a contextual action overflow, I guess. So you would have these 3 vertical dots, like we said before. You touch the overflow affordance, and then you see a pop-up menu. So this works well with things, secondary actions like delete. Also things like, if you're in Google Play and you're looking at an app, you can press the 3 vertical dots to immediately start installing that app. Also things like edit, or whatever you want, any other things, or share as well. The contextual action bar is certainly kind of the more standard, more common approach to doing this. So what you would do here is you would select an object by long pressing it, and then the context of the screen changes, right? So your action bar changes into this contextual mode, and then you can take action from there. For example, here you can long press to pick up a note in Google Keep, and then change its color, set a reminder, or archive it. You'll notice that here in Google Keep, you can long press, like I said before, long press to pick it up. If you don't move your finger around, it just selects it and lets you take action. If you start moving your finger, it'll actually start dragging it. So these two are very, I guess, they work in tandem, if possible.
And one of my favorite things about the contextual action bar is it's a very easy way to act on multiple items at once. So you can imagine in this the gallery example here, if you'd long pressed on an individual photo, it would offer one selection of actions which are applicable to a single item. But if you just quickly tap on 3 extra, so you have a group of 4 selected, you can very quickly act on them, very quickly share them, delete them, whatever it is you want to do, much quicker than having to kind of go into one item, perform an action, come back up to the group level, down again. So contextual action bar is really powerful in that way.
One other note I wanted to make here is that rather than taking the action first and then selecting which objects you want to take action on, like is very common on other platforms, on Android it's really kind of select first, then take action. The nice thing about this is that it's very much direct manipulation minded, right? I mean, you start with the content, you start with the object, and then you perform the action. The other nice thing about the contextual action bar here is actually you can offer things like select all really easily. So once you long press to select, you can offer like a spinner in the action bar, offering the user to select all or deselect or things like that. All right, moving on, since we're running super short on time. Another very popular way of offering a secondary action is to offer something in line with the list item running along the right side of the screen. So here you'll notice that with this individual object, another action you could take is make changes to it, change its settings. And this is offered as a settings icon all the way on the right side of the screen. You'll notice that there's a little divider here, and this serves the purpose of indicating that there are two distinct touch regions. So if I touch here, one thing will happen. If I touch here, something else will happen. The other thing you should keep in mind when presenting this type of UI is that you should make sure that the entire right side of the screen or right side of this item is dedicated to that secondary action. So if I touch above the icon or below the settings icon, you should still trigger the settings action. And that's really to kind of simplify the number of touch regions or simplify the touch regions on the screen and to prevent human error with touches.
And those are kind of echoed by the touch highlight. So if you were to touch on the main item, the entire line would light up to kind of like underscore the fact this is the main action. And if you touch on the secondary action, just the area up to the divider would light up.
Yep. One last thing I wanted to point out here is another good example of this. Since this entire episode has been driven by examples, we wanted to see kind of these techniques used in action. Another really good example of this is in the contact details screen. Your Android phone probably has a contacts app. If you're on a Nexus device, it's probably the People app. When you're looking at contact details, if you look at a list of phone numbers for a specific contact, you'll notice that each of those phone numbers has an additional secondary action on the right to send a text message to that number. So the primary touch target, the phone number itself, will try to place a call to that number, but then if you touch on the right-hand side, there's a little text message icon that'll actually take the user to the composed text message screen. So lots of different ways to offer additional actions on objects. So I think that about does it for collections. So we talked about a couple of things today. We talked about specifically kind of how you can offer filtering, searching, sorting through collections, I guess the consumption side, as well as how to present collections in a very responsive way. And then we talked about mutation of collections, adding, removing items, reordering them, as well as taking action on items within a set of objects. So that's about it for today. With that, I'm your host, Roman Urich.
And bye from me, Nick Butcher.
Thanks for joining, guys.